simple society, on how sense is attributed to the world, meanings are created. So instead of modeling complexity, I use complexity simply as the starting point for opening up the questions of sense and meaning making. The implication of that is if we cannot understand the complexity of the world in all its complexity in real time, there are lots of different ways to interpret the world, and that gives you the full range of different economic imaginaries that exist. And then you can ask, if you like, what I might call my Orwell question. Everybody needs an ideology. So if everybody needs an ideology, every ideology is equal. Every imaginary is equal. But we know already, simply from observation and living in the world and how people react to crises and so forth, that while everybody may need an ideology, some ideologies, some imaginaries are more equal than others. So we can then begin to inquire, why is it that some imaginaries, some sense and meaning makings become hegemonic, become powerful, become the basis for the organization of this type of economy, this sort of political system, and so forth. And so that's the way in which I'm using complexity. I'm not interested in modeling it. I simply use it as a sort of a starting point for thinking about how complexity is reduced. That leads me down that model on the one hand of sense and meaning, and the fact there are different ways in which sense and meaning can be understood, and one can begin to compare those and see which become hegemonic, which become dominant, which become really foundational for structuring. And I can also look at complexity reduction in terms of how can we stop everything happening at once in the same space? How do you establish structures? And then look at those structures and critique those also from the viewpoint of their biases, their selectivities, their asymmetries, the ways in which they come to be the basis of domination. And I thought that was very simple, and now you've disturbed and disoriented me by thinking and pointing that, in fact, using complexity in that way can open up the space for a symbolic violence. My ideas, my theoretical system is more complex than yours, therefore I deserve to be a member of the National Academy of Sciences in Warsaw and not you, because your model is far too simple to deal with the complexities of the real world. Very often the simple model is the best one. It's more effective if we sat down and tried to understand all that's complex about the current financial crisis. Somebody else will have solved it before we've worked out what causes it. So I'm not valorizing the more complex sense-making over the more simple sense-making. You can have a pragmatic judgment. And sometimes Occam's razor, the simplest solution is the best solution as long as it's adequate to the complexity of the world, which is sort of a paradox, how one reduces complexity enough to make it useful, but not to oversimplify so that it's not adequate to intervening in the world.
If I could just jump on this concept of complexity to continue discussing it. I was quite interested by your critique of both Hayek and Keynes. You said that they both failed to grasp the complexity of the modern capitalist economy. I have always rather liked actually both of them, precisely because I thought that complexity was something I appreciated. Hayek was his criticism of central planning and the idea of information, where I always thought that the central idea of Hayek's economics is, in philosophy, is that the world is so ludicrously complex that we can never really grasp what's going on. That's why it's better to leave things alone, because if we try to patch it, we don't know what the consequences will be. And Keynes, with his concept of radical uncertainty, again, seems to me to have the idea of complexity and the fact that we cannot grasp it as central. So have I misunderstood Keynes and Hayek, or have I misunderstood what you said?
You've misunderstood what I said, because I didn't say they didn't grasp complexity. What I said is they didn't critique the foundation within which they were then debating. What I pulled up was this particular slide, which doesn't necessarily make the world more complex than Hayek's understanding of it or Keynes's understanding of it. What I'm saying is they are debating on the grounds of what are the appropriate economic policies in a world marked by radical uncertainty, Keynes, or by such overwhelming cognitive complexity that one could never plan. But telling me that the world is cognitively complex, or telling me that there's a lot of radical uncertainty, doesn't tell me what the sources of that radical uncertainty are, and it doesn't tell me what, in particular social context, the sources of cognitive complexity or uncertainty are. So what I want to do is to say radical uncertainty, no problems with that. Hayek's idea that any planning that takes place is likely to fail. If you remember, I said that if you try to plan the economy, your economic imaginary is only ever a subset of all the things that may be relevant to delivering an economic policy. There is a constitutive outside, the excluded bit, which means that when you try to plan the economy, you're not planning the economy. You're planning a limited set of activities in the economy, which will always overwhelm any attempts to intervene, because there are things that you've not taken into account. So I think what I've said at the general level is consistent both with Keynes's notion of radical uncertainty and Hayek's Austrian economics, which says don't even think of intervening, it's too complex. But I want to suggest that the radical uncertainty that Keynes identifies and already begins to ground in the nature of money, in the nature of the potential disequilibria, since there are many functions of money, and one can't guarantee that the different functions of money will automatically equilibrate. So there's always the potential for a crisis in a capitalist economy in which money is capital, in which money is money, in which money performs a number of different functions. In the same way, I would argue that for Hayek, you could apply his arguments to any society, anywhere in the world, unless you go down the road of symbolic violence and say we could actually plan a primitive tribal society based on hunting and fishing, but we can't plan one based on market mediation and so forth. So I want not only to address the questions of a Keynes or a Hayek, but to say on what ground is radical uncertainty generated? Where is the source of this radical uncertainty in an economy organized on the basis of profit-oriented, market-mediated exchange? And then I can begin to understand specifically why Keynes, when writing about radical uncertainty, wrote on the theory of employment, money, and so forth, and not about, isn't life complicated? And why Hayek's critique was developed specifically against a particular type of economic intervention and so forth. There is an unstated ground on which both of those people are developing their ideas. What I want to do is to recover the ground in order then to understand the nature of the arguments and the disputes between them. And in terms, you mentioned systems theory. The systems theory I developed is not complexity systems, but the work of another systems theorist, Niklas Luhmann, who's quite conservative. He says one of the problems of complexity reduction of codes and programs is you cannot see what you cannot see. And I think there's an interesting debate between Keynes and Hayek, but they cannot see what the common ground of their debate is, because they both take for granted the nature of the capitalist economy. And that then leads to a different type of debate. And if you brought into the equation a Karl Marx or a David Harvey or somebody else who would also talk to you about uncertainty and the need for fixing uncertainty and so forth, but they would be working from a very different grounds. I think you slightly misunderstood what I was saying. It's what's missing from that debate is an understanding of the grounds on which radical uncertainty emerges, the grounds on which Hayek is not simply saying, let alone, leave things alone. It is a critique of a particular alternative mode of intervention, a particular form of planning and so forth. And it certainly doesn't follow from Hayek's arguments or from Simon's arguments or others, that if we leave well alone, it's best to leave well alone to the market, because the invisible hand knows best. There are other ways you can leave well alone. You can leave well alone by allowing an ecology of self-organizing partnerships and networks to fight things out. So it's a market in networks and not a market in commodity production. That might also be a solution, allowing 1,000 partnerships to bloom and then see which are more or less important. The Hayek's uncertainty does not produce the warrant for leaving everything to the market. What it does is to leave, it just provides a warrant for not leaving everything to top-down planning. But the alternative to top-down planning, the alternative to state, is not the market. That is itself a simplification. There are many other ways of organizing complex interdependence than relying on the invisible hand of the market. If one were to allow for competition, for example, among partnerships, competition among social networks, competition within the solidarity economy, that would also solve the problem. So the market doesn't follow as the only alternative to top-down planning from Hayek's viewpoint.
Then when you say about that it's possible to have other ways, like a competition between networks, are you speaking from Imperia, or is it a theoretical possibility?
What I'm looking at is the ways in which, and this is a very interesting metaphor, markets can be organized between different social enterprises, forms of social innovation, which are not profit-oriented, which have the opportunity to say, will you let us try this, or we can solve these social problems in this way rather than that way. I think there is a slippage in Hayek's argument. Let's agree, and I'm more than happy to do so, that a single point of planning in a complex society is always going to produce planning failure, the failure of the command economy. Hayek, which is typical of that particular period, when you either had plan rationality or market rationality, thinks if plan rationality doesn't work, if the state can't deliver, the alternative has to be market rationality, because those are the only alternatives. What I want to suggest is in a complex world, there are more ways of organizing, coordinating social relations besides relying on a money-mediated market mechanism. One can also say, let's see how different types of social partnership work to solve social problems. They may need revenues to help them to do so, and we will allocate the revenues, but that's not quite the same as saying let's them compete to make the maximum amount of profit from delivering social policies and so forth. So one can allow for different forms of rivalry in order that you don't try to do everything from top down, from a single center of command or leverage. It does not follow that if you can't have top-down planning, everything has to be in the market. And that is, I think, the slippage in Hayek's argument. Plan rationality, market rationality, and that's the set of possibilities.
I would have a question about what you suggested, the idea of reimagining economies by moving beyond the growth paradigm, beyond the market paradigm, and seeing the economy as, or to re-embedding the economy to the society and the natural networks, the bigger picture of life, and seeing it as more than just earning money. And the thing that I'm seeing in it is the risk that we then could equate economy to life, because it's just provisioning for ourselves by using the natural world. You know what I mean? And
yes.
Therefore diluting the concept. So how do we move from this one channel market solution paradigm to still sort of keeping the concepts of what economy is by not going too far?
Yes, the reference to material provisioning, I'm not sure whether I made it explicit or not, was to Karl Polanyi's debates way back in the 40s, 50s, 60s. I first came across Karl Polanyi in my undergraduate anthropology course, when the debate was whether or not you needed a substantive economics to understand pre-monetary societies, or you could model those societies using the same formal tools as one did for monetary societies. His argument was that if we understand the economy in substantive terms, we're looking at material provisioning. How do societies organize the appropriation and transformation of nature to deliver things? And that's his definition of economy. That's not the same as saying that the only activities that occur in a society is the appropriation and transformation of nature for purposes of material provisioning. There are a lot of other activities that go on, some of which may have material provisioning as a presupposition. So, for example, policing is not itself material provisioning, but policemen need uniforms, or if not, they need at least some sort of symbolic signification. Many of the other things that go on in the society, education, are not directly material provisioning. It's the performance of intellectual labour, the transformation of ideas and so forth. So I don't think, at least in my understanding, to say that let's look at material provisioning and not at that subset of activities that are involved in material provisioning, in other words, those that are delivered through the market. And even the market is not quite the same as the capitalist market. There are lots of markets that are not organised on capitalist lines, and there are lots of ways of dealing with material provisioning that don't involve the market at all. Householding, political redistribution, tributary systems, and so forth. So we need a broader understanding of material provisioning, so we don't then think that the market, or the capitalist market, is the only way to organise material provisioning. But we certainly should not reduce society to a calculus about material provisioning as if nothing else matters at all. It is simply, material provisioning is the basic precondition for other activities that are not directly bound with material provisioning, for art, for debate, for discussion, for pleasure of varying kinds and so forth. So if you read me as saying, having an economistic reading of society, but simply a broader understanding of the economy, that would be a misreading. As one of the American generals, they're often not very bright, said, I misspoke myself. So I misspoke myself if I gave the impression that economy equals society, society equals economy. I was simply concerned with expanding the meaning of economy to refuse, to reject the equation of profit-oriented, market-mediated economic organisation, with the only way to organise economic life is that it wasn't to reduce society to a purely economic mechanism.
Yes, who's the next? Who would like to give a question, a comment? Yeah.
I have a question, yeah. I wanted to ask you how to place your theory, cultural, political economy, among other theories dealing with similar questions. For example, how does cultural, political economy relate to institutional approach, presented, for example, by Douglas North, who is suggesting, assuming that economic institutions are implying certain mental models, or to anthropological approaches present, for example, in Mary Douglas' writings, and her ideas about thinking institutions, like about that institutions are implying some sorts of cognitive concepts. So what are the relations, inspirations, differences? That's my question.
Right, I mean, if you followed my presentation, you will see that any serious social scientist, sooner or later, has to take semiosis seriously. So there's no argument on our part that, my God, everybody has ignored meaning making until we were bright enough to see that we could bring it in to economic analysis. Nonetheless, I think there would be a difference between, say, Douglas North's new economic institutionalism and the idea that what institutions are efficient solutions emerge as efficient solutions to particular economic problems, and what helps those efficient solutions to be found is a particular set of mental maps or mental models. The reason I argue that they're different from here is firstly that what is done is to introduce a theoretical innovation within a neoclassical economics framework. In other words, you still assume the rationality of Homo economicus, you assume the rationality of the market and so forth. And just as the Coué's theorem came into being, why is it that we don't do everything through the market? Why sometimes do we have hierarchies or organizations? Because sometimes the transaction costs of doing everything through the market are far too great. The gain is no longer worth the candle. So we do some things through the market and some things through organization, but you can be assured that the balance between market and organization is the efficient solution. In the same way, when you look at Douglas North's work, he is simply showing that an important part of an efficient solution to making markets work is the Darwinian selection of certain mental models or certain mental maps of how the world works. And in that sense, the mental models or the mental maps are the necessary adjuncts to efficient institutions. From what we presented, I'm saying we because Nylin, who's here, is co-authoring much of this work with me. From what you presented, you'll see that we do not believe that you evaluate semiosis in terms of its efficiency in solving problems of market-based or potentially market-based transactions. Now that's totally different from Mary Douglas's work, which is grounded in anthropology or anthropological observation. And there are many cultural anthropologists. I'm not sure, I'll tell you why in a minute, that I want to follow Mary Douglas. But I would certainly be happy, for example, to follow Clifford Pearce in his particular readings of cultural anthropology, because he takes meaning-making, sense-making in a very, very broad sense. It's a long time since I read Mary Douglas, and more recent interest in Mary Douglas has come from people who use it in terms of group grid readings and mappings of social relations. And that seems to me, again, far too simplifying model of what is complex. I'm doing symbolic violence here to Mary Douglas by saying that theory is not sophisticated enough to do the business. But I think this, certainly, she's taking, in our terms, group is the structuration, grid is the semiosis. But I think that that's far too simple for what we want to do, which is to use cultural political economy. And an important part of cultural political economy is using the ideology critique, Jessop's critique, the critique of ideology, the critique of domination. I think that if we look at Mary Douglas, certainly there's an interesting paradigm there, a certain set of puzzles that are being solved, but you wouldn't be able to use it in the ways that we want to use our approach to go on and critique the ideological character of imaginaries, not the same as equating ideology and imaginary, and to look at the patterns of domination. It's far too small scale to be able to answer some of the questions that we would do. But if you ask me to choose, as I would implicitly asked to choose earlier between Keynes and Hayek, I would go with Mary Douglas over Douglas North. But I would argue that there are more fish in the sea to look at than Hayek and Keynes or Douglas North and Mary Douglas.
Yeah.
I don't see. Yes, please, you're welcome.
I was wondering, where do you see the potential for the change of those imaginaries if we see ourselves in a system that crisis did not bring any change in the discourse, and they seem to be constantly reproduced and rather strengthen the hegemonic ideology rather than undermining it. So where do you see the possibilities or the potential for change, and in which way could it come?
Okay, if we look at the rise of neoliberalism, it began, the planning for the neoliberal project began in Paris in the 1930s, and it led to the foundation of the Mont Pelerin Society. If you look at Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, which I think was written in the early 60s, what he says there is effectively there's no idea as powerful as an idea whose time has come. When the crisis comes, and the crisis will come, because the post-war settlement, state planning, full employment and so forth are irrational, we will be there without alternative. And that then leads on to Rahm Emanuel's never let a serious crisis go to waste. The problem that we face at the moment, I say we in the sense of, let's assume those that want to see some fundamental transformations in the contemporary system face, is that we have capitulated far too often to the neoliberal ideology rather than challenging it. And the centre ground has continually shifted towards neoliberalism. And that's because there's not been a concerted critique of neoliberalism on the one hand, but just a little bit of guerrilla fighting against this policy or that policy, but nobody's challenged the fundamental irrationality, even within the framework of the logic of capital accumulation, the fundamental irrationalities of neoliberalism. And what that means is that when the crises come along, the people who have the answers ready-made are the neoliberals and not the Greens, not the various forms of socialism and so forth. And so they've been completely disoriented and disempowered by the crisis. I mean, I am observing this for the last 3 years, 4 years in the United Kingdom. Why? Because New Labour was neoliberalism with a Christian socialist base. They maintained the policies of Thatcher and Major government. As you know, Mrs. Thatcher died last week. There were a lot of tributes on BBC World to her. And one of the killer quotations, interviews with her, was, "Mrs. Thatcher, what do you think your biggest achievement has been in your years of government?" And her answer was, "Tony Blair." In other words, she produced New Labour, which was neoliberal. She removed the challenge to neoliberalism, and I described New Labour, or at least Tony Blair's New Labour, as neoliberalism with a Christian socialist face. And I was roundly criticised for it. And when he ceased to be Prime Minister, he joined the board of JP Morgan and became a Catholic. So I feel vindicated. But what that means is that if the left, if social democracy maintains, with a slightly different political gloss, the logic of neoliberalism, when the crisis comes, there is no alternative within the mainstream political spectrum, and it's far easier for convinced neoliberals to explain the crisis than it is for half-hearted neoliberals to explain the crisis. Because the half-hearted neoliberals will have to admit to mistakes in a way that the convinced neoliberals will not. The convinced neoliberals will say, we didn't have enough market, we didn't roll back the state enough, we haven't put down the pressure on the social wage enough, we need to roll back entitlements. So they can double up. But the half-hearted neoliberals can't, because they only were half-hearted anyway, with the exception of Tony Blair, the wolf in sheep's clothing. But for the others, they were doing it against their better instincts in some cases, and that leaves them totally paralysed to both reflect on the mistakes that they made and then come up with an alternative. They need a period in the wilderness to do that, but in the period in the wilderness, the neoliberals, sorry, the New Labour, the Social Democrats, the others who were complicit, but half-heartedly complicit, by the time they've made their mea maxima culpa rethought, those who are convinced neoliberals have already reorganised the game, doubled up the stakes, entrenched their positions further, and so forth. So I think that's the problem. That there was far too much giving into, but that's the wrong way to put it, because it makes it look like a choice. if we go back to my diagram of meaning and sense-making, neoliberalism became the hegemonic economic imaginary. To find a place in that world, you needed a sub-hegemony, not a counter-hegemony. So many of those on the left, and indeed those on the more far right, had variations on the neoliberal theme, not a fundamental, well-grounded critique of neoliberalism, which is why when the crisis comes, neoliberalism can use it to reinforce itself and put the cost on other people.
So, am I understanding you correctly? Do you see the potential of a change in new political formations? Or since you referred to the British political scene, or is this the only way? Do you see any potential in, I don't know, grassroots activities, or we just didn't?
I think that what we need is a lot of
Gramsci.
well, Gramsci is the easy trick answer, but that doesn't do the business. What we need to do, in the words of Eric Olin Wright and my colleague Andrew Sayer and so forth, we need a lot of practical utopias. They have to be developed at a very low level scale, network connecting. But you need to be able to show in practice, and not just in terms of some abstract speculative scheme, that there are real functioning alternatives. And on the basis of practical examples that one can organize the world differently, use those then to build up the alternatives, to build coalitions and so forth. But just as the neoliberal project was envisaged as a long-term war of position, and that is precisely the Gramscian point. This is not a war of maneuver. You're not going to suddenly take advantage of a crisis and overnight transform the system. You have to put the pieces in play in advance. And that's not just one or two practical examples. You have to shift the language as well. One of my colleagues, Norman Fairclough, who's in the linguistics department, wrote a very fine book, New Labour, New Language. And in order to be able to make new labour work, they have to change the whole vocabulary, the structures of feeling, the values and so forth, back to your question on values, in order to make new labour seem plausible alternative. And one needs then not only practical examples, but you need to challenge the hegemony of a vocabulary that one finds in neoliberalism. For example, the productive versus the parasitic. Those who live through the market, those who batten off the market and so forth. You need to think about what it means to have a welfare policy outside the framework of parasitism, out the framework of entitlement as somehow unjustified. Entitlements, they're only interested in their entitlements, as if that's a negative thing. That claiming your entitlements is somehow making you a parasite. You paid your taxes, you're entitled to your entitlements, that's why they're entitlements. But the whole way in which that vocabulary has been inflected, and negatively inflected, is a big problem. So you need practical examples, you need interventions in language, you need to change vocabularies, structures of feeling, and that is waiting for the next crisis. But you need to try to anticipate the nature of the next crisis as well, and not just say, when the crisis comes. Baudrillard wrote a book, if you remember, on the Gulf War didn't happen. Well, of course it did, but I think we have to think of writing a book, the crisis will not happen. Because the crisis won't be the crisis. It won't be a general crisis. It will be a crisis of a particular kind, in particular conditions, in particular circumstances. And unless you're prepared for what you think the next crisis will be, rather than just planning for the next crisis, which is bound to be the terminal crisis and so forth, you will not be in a position. So in other words, the practical utopias, the semantic shifts, the struggles over vocabulary, can't just be general. They have to be adapted to particular local, national, quasi-continental, but also bigger standards. So you're prepared, not in general terms. We always told you this crisis was coming, now will you listen to us? But we told you this particular crisis was coming. These are the solutions that we have to hand. Now give us a chance to implement them. That, I think, is what's at stake. So it's a Gramscian strategy. but he's not a Gramscian strategist at the level of the battle for hearts and minds. It has to be a battle at the level of practical examples, local scale experiments, but they can also be global scale experiments, fair trading, for example, safe, environmentally safe forest standards and so forth. This can be played out on a global scale, doesn't have to be immediately in this neighborhood, but the more practical examples that can be developed, connected up and so forth, the more basis you have for showing that another world is possible.
Let me say, Bob, that you proved how important is our topic, culture and development, understood, of course, according to your way. So culture as the creativity, culture as creation of meanings and creation of practice, and development understood as social change or transformation of the economic system. And I fully follow your way of thinking. However, I would like to say that I shouldn't, I wouldn't and I shouldn't wait, we shouldn't wait for the next crisis. We have this crisis to be overcome, and I think that there is also a practical field of our action. For example, the question of intellectual property rights. The way how the intellectual property rights will be regulated, will be understood and regulated, will create or will close the space for your local actions, for your local activities. How we solve the problem, this will open the space or close the space. So even we will create a new language without this practical mechanism of new economization of existing resources, we will be not able to prove that this world will work. It's correct, not true, but
yes,
correct.
Yes.
And therefore we can't wait for the next crisis. We have to work now.
Here and now.
Yes, here and now.
I think you're just
On many levels. Yes. On theoretical level, on vocabulary, but also on practical different type of actions to prove that market economy requires also different type of social economic relations to function at all. If not, everything will collapse. Let me express my gratitude to Bob, who agreed to come and to give a lecture. Thank you very much, Bob, for your presentation and of course for your coming. And Eileen mentioned here is Bob's wife and also a close collaborator in the cultural, political economy agenda.
And let me just thank you for pointing out, as he always does, the difference between us. He's an optimist and thinks you can change things now. And I'm a pessimist and I'm waiting for the next crisis.
You are ironist.
Yeah, I'm an ironist.
But this time you are much more near optimistic way of thinking.
Yes, well, this is the advantage of cross-cultural dialogue around development.
Thank you very much.
And I thought, I was attending
And you changed your day because you should be and then something.
In the mid-60s, this was a famous document which was translated and all that is languages. Last year.
Status swojej specyficzny, system się nie wymaga.
You know each other for a long time.
You write the book, right?
So you will stay, you have to stay, if you are just...
Oczywiście, że nie. Spółdzielnie, znaczy spółdzielnie to nie jest spółdzielnie model. Spółdzielnie to jest bardzo dobrze.
Czyli to nie może być
Because you know the last days, not now, last days were...
Ale strasznie jestem podekscytowany.
To się cieszy. To się cieszy. Ale potwierdziłeś tam, że przyjeżdżasz
Tak, nie wiem, czy potwierdziłem.
No to potwierdź, bo on inaczej ci pokoju nie załatwi. Człowiek musi gdzieś tam napisać, bo inaczej nie będziesz miał pokoju, bo już spał na tym, na korytarzu.
Super. No. Potwierdzam w takim razie.
So you will be there in autumn?
Do widzenia.
No. Oh, okay. Because I will be in Berlin in autumn again.
But we are backwards and forwards regularly.
Yeah.
Where will you be based?
I will be writing a book. I was at Humboldt in autumn last. I'm on leave.
Right, okay.
And now I'm here at the Warsaw University. And then I still have research money and I will stay in Berlin. Also two personal reasons. I have a sick mother and they let me go, otherwise I wouldn't.
Okay. Sending an email.
I will.
Use that.
Yeah.
They sometimes don't understand the consequences. For example, many politicians claim that all the countries
So I see you there.
their
Yeah, great.
competitiveness.
Great. Great.
All the countries, they even cannot understand that this is a relative.
Thank you very much.
Exactly
Yes, yes, I know. I'm preparing myself. Thank you.
But I think it's because they claim they think it's like
This is Teresa, who is a good friend of Birgit Zahn.
Oh, Birgit Zahn, yes.
And is in fact Polish. We downloaded a paper of hers just last week. And I said, oh,
Swedish.
she was Polish because
In
she's
German.
Sweden. And I told you.
There you are.
Proving that she has Polish roots.
And I'm just really, I'm the first time I left Holland when I was a child. And I learned German, whatever language.
Probably it's your mother tongue, is it?
Yes, but it's not my best at all. So now I'm really, yes, I'm really learning. And it's not easy. I cope well on the daily basis, but intellectual conversations, you know.
It's another thing. Yes, every day an academic are quite different. I mean, we have the opposite problem. I don't German as an academic reading language.
But you can learn, you speak quite well.
But the problem is, when I first came to Germany after having learned to read
Yes, yes.
So it was a very good example. It was a big example of learning to learn. There was something I could do most Germans couldn't, which was discuss class opera. And something every German should do that I couldn't, which was all done in Sophia.
And you know, in Poland, the language is incredibly important for very many reasons. Yes, but it's also the lost. It was the Polish language was the only way to keep the Polish people together during the time of not being a state, not being a state. So it's very important. So I can see it. I know that my mother, because we came from a Polish region where a dialect was Silesia, you know, and there were some words like you have in Germany, in Baden-Württemberg, wherever, you know, they have this special word. And my mother always corrected me when I used it. No, Hachini, you are not supposed to say like this. You know, And now when I'm here, I remember this.
Nie jest to, jest
When
autentycznym
I say
równodziałem.
something in Polish,
Można nie
in the
zdobyć
intellectual
świat,
conversation at the
ale
course
przyczynić się do jego zmiany.
I see how Agnieszka
Nawet
gets
chciał,
pain
gdybyśmy
from
znali,
that,
że
you
trzeba
know,
zdobyć,
because
to i tak
in a
trzeba.
way as if I'm degrading myself because I'm talking, maybe over but no, it's her sympathy, and I can see, so that's how she suggests, sometimes she suggests, you almost with saving my authority, saving my authority. And you know,
Masz ciepłą wodę w kranie,
whenever I listen to
dzisiaj
German,
Yeah.
I'm not hearing a lot of the wise words that end in Y
Yeah.
are not English. They are
w tym, co mówił o wyspaniu. Centralny moment, o czym
what do you mean? You mean in philosophy or?
no, in everyday language.
Yeah.
że nie wystarczy.
When I say wise words, I
Yeah.
don't mean Weisheit.
Nah, you do, what, so what do you, in which sense do you use it?
I że wszyscy musimy mieć jakiś tam powód, bo bez tego się nie da.
Big mouth, because I can now be able to think of an example.
Otóż co jest
No, don't. I mean, it doesn't matter, but you have your reasons to say
z
this.
punktu widzenia
I mean,
działania
in Berlin they all the time have some kind of Yiddish thing.
For example,
w
policy-wise.
zależności od tego,
Policy-wise, we need to do this.
otóż jego zrozumienie.
Nobody would say policy.
Wise in British.
In British, we would say that policy-wise is, I would think,
Oddziałuje na zachowanie wszystkich innych.
Okay.
not such a good one. I will come up with one and I will send you an email. I will say, look, I'm right. And I think always, yes, these boys always have to be right. And I should always put in the grammar school boy said, so I must always be right.
This is what my mother always said to me.
Okay, so
Very nice to meet you.
Teresa will be in Berlin.
In autumn.
In autumn. She was in the Humboldt in autumn.
But then I will be, I don't know, I have not arranged any affiliation yet. I still have a flat there, you know. You have been there once, do you remember very many years ago? 20 years ago. 20 years ago. When you attended a conference which I co-organized. It doesn't matter. And I mean, you always...
So many conferences in
Of
the
course.
last 20 years.
And so I still have a flat despite that I'm working in Sweden, but I have the flat for a long time, so it's like, it's quite, what do you say, price, needed, yes, and I share it, so otherwise I couldn't afford it. Yeah, I need it. So I don't really care with affiliation. I want to be
You have
there.
an affiliation which starts speaking.
Yes, and as I said, they let me go because my mother is sick, so they know that I'm her only narrow relative. And I have still,
She's your dependent.
in a way, yes, and I really, it's like her last way, so it's so, yeah, this is life. So I see you in Berlin. Have a nice time here, enjoy it.
Send me an email when you know, well, you know your address in that case, and when you'll be there, because we will be back as and then back to Berlin.
And when are you going, aren't you sometimes also going to Asia?
Yes, I do.
Of course, I do. And
There's a pension relative.
yes, I know very well what you do.
Yeah, so we go to Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, sometimes to China regularly.
You came from Hong Kong, right? This is what I, in a way, remember somewhere there. From Hong Kong. Yeah. So this is where you... The empire. Nice visit here. You were lucky that it became warm again. It was very long.
Everywhere.
Yes, I know.
Najmniej przez teorię, ale najmniej przez otwieranie przestrzeni tego, ludzie mogli eksplorować. I przynoszą ich przed wiedzę. Są potrzebne generatory przesłaniania. To nie jest też tylko ze znajomymi, to jest enabling, to jest ten proces, który